This episode contains graphic depictions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. By Monday morning after the murder of Rosa Trice, the storms had moved out of Atlanta. The paper's weather prophecy for that day simply said, cloudy and cooler. Atlanta had three major white newspapers then: the Atlanta Constitution, the Atlanta Georgian, and the Atlanta Journal. These papers were the informational lifeblood of Atlanta life in the early 1900s. Remember, it's 1911, so there's no TV, and commercial radio wouldn't arrive till 1922. Newspapers were the source for local, national, and international news. The three Atlanta papers were highly competitive, and rival journalists were in a never-ending battle to outscoop each other. It wasn't uncommon for newspapers to publish several editions per day, sometimes printing a morning, afternoon, and evening edition. The morning edition of the Constitution was only 10 pages long on Monday, January 23rd. I've browsed hundreds, possibly thousands of pages of newspapers from back then, and I can tell you that the news on this day was pretty standard. Lots of mundane things. A list of acts playing at Atlanta's downtown theaters, an upcoming basketball game between the Birmingham Athletic Club and the Atlanta Athletic Club, an ad from a local department store advertising $2 hats, half-price underwear, and something called a fancy, stiff bosom shirt for 50 cents. I have no idea what a fancy, stiff bosom shirt is, but 50 cents seems like a steal. Unsurprisingly, there were lots of agricultural updates that day as well. In 1911, the rising city of Atlanta was a tiny dot of urbanism situated in a sea of rural farmland. That day's paper had a guy who sold 300 hogs for a, quote, small fortune, an article about boll weevils devastating southern cotton crops, though the pests had not yet arrived in Georgia then. It had a section where people could write a letter to a farm expert with questions. One of the questions was about the right combination of horse manure and acid phosphate needed to fertilize corn. Another was from a guy whose cow had a rash, quote, on the left side of the udder, just above the left front teat, end quote. Hashtag bovine boob rash. There were lots of transportation-related articles in that day's paper, too. A list of railroad departure times, trains leaving from Atlanta, bound to places like Chattanooga, Shreveport, Charlotte, Birmingham, and New York City. It also had a front-page story about a Canadian pilot named Birdman Douglas McCurdy and his plan to fly his airship from Key West to Havana. As a point of reference, this is just about 7 years after Wilbur and Orville Wright made that first flight at Kitty Hawk. There was also an ad in the classifieds looking for 50 men to enroll in the Automobile College of Atlanta. The ad promised to train young men to repair and drive automobiles. Now, it's important to note here that at the time of our story, automobiles were still pretty new. Cars were a luxury only for the well-to-do. And if you walked the streets of Atlanta in 1911, you would see both horse-drawn carriages and automobiles side by side. All of these new transportation innovations were examples of the massive technological transition America was going through at this time. Whereas the free flow of information has defined our day, aka the internet, the lives of Americans back then were being defined by the free flow of bodies via planes, trains, and automobiles. In that same day's paper, there was also a smattering of things that were just plain weird. An ad for a gonorrhea cure. All you had to do was mail them $1, and they'd send you the treatment in the mail. Ugh. There was a story about the nearest living descendant of George Washington recently dying in a small town north of Atlanta, and there was an ad for Madame Del Rey, a psychic palm reader who could advise on, quote, love, family and business affairs, lawsuits, marriages, investments, and lost articles, end quote. But the darkest articles that day were the ones dealing with violence. A front-page story of a 14-year-old kid stabbing one of his friends. The story of Ethel Olson, who fired a bullet at her husband to defend herself because he was trying to throw acid in her face. A guy being treated at Grady Hospital who tried to kill himself by drinking 6 bottles of laudanum. Laudanum was basically an opium cocktail prescribed back then as a painkiller and sort of a cure-all for all kinds of ailments. And there, on page 5, all the way at the bottom. 3 little paragraphs topped by this headline: Negro woman found murdered near home. Now, let me inject a personal note here. Throughout the series, I'll be using either the terms African American or Black people. However, at the time of this story, the predominant terms used in the press were Negro, Negress, which is for a female, or colored. Now, I'll only use those terms when quoting either a publication or a person from that era. It's important to remember that at the time of this story, African Americans were in a completely different social class than whites. I'll talk a lot more about this later. Also, the 3 major Atlanta newspapers were owned by white men, employed white men, and sold almost exclusively to literate white readers. That the brutal murder of an innocent black woman got little more than a few sentences shouldn't be entirely surprising. The article about Rosa Trice's murder was concise, but there were 4 key facts around the circumstances of her death. Number 1, African American female. Number 2, skull smashed with a blunt object. Number 3, throat cut with a knife. And number 4, her body was dragged. Remember these 4 facts because they're going to be important later. The newspaper men didn't know it yet, but this isolated murder in this desolate southern part of the city was a harbinger. This was an early warning sign of a gruesome outbreak of bloodshed about to sweep across the South's grandest city. My name is B.T. Harman, and you're listening to episode 3 of Catlick, an American Ripper. It's worth noting here that there were 2 other stories in that January 23rd newspaper with headlines featuring Atlanta's black citizens. One was about a, quote, Negro murderer, end quote, being abducted by a mob in a nearby town. The other led with the headline, At Point of Pistol, Negro Robs Depot. These kinds of unflattering headlines were really common back then. Having read thousands of Atlanta newspaper headlines from the 1910s, I can tell you that positive, glowing stories about the African American community were incredibly rare. It's like the editors of the papers loved splashing the misdeeds, both real and alleged, of Atlanta's black community in front of their readers. This was never more evident in Atlanta than in 1906, 5 years before Rosa Trice was killed. That fall brought 4 days of unbelievable violence into the heart of downtown Atlanta. Historians call this the Atlanta Race Riot of 1906. And to be honest, it's one of the most disturbing events in Atlanta's history. The groundwork for the riot was laid by the local Atlanta newspapers when they began printing speculative claims of black men attacking and raping white women. This propaganda eventually prompted thousands of white men to begin assembling in downtown Atlanta on the night of September 22nd, 1906. These men were pissed off, boozed up, and ready to fight. The scene eventually devolved into a bloodthirsty mob that set out into the city on the hunt for anyone with black skin. They assaulted hundreds of African Americans, killing and dismembering dozens of them in the streets of Atlanta. Eventually, the militia was called in to stop the violence, and when the dust settled, the total body count was somewhere between 25 and 40, depending on what you read. It was a total massacre. Black Atlanta was traumatized, and the city would never be the same. Now, why is this story from 1906 relevant to our story in 1911? Well, it's important that you know the context of all this. This is a weird time in American history, roughly the halfway point between slavery ending and the civil rights era beginning. Bottom line, in 1911, life is still really hard for black people in the South, and we're still decades away from anything getting better. So it's important to understand how white readers may have read this article about the death of Rosa Trice on January 23rd. Black people and whites lived in two different universes then. So a black woman mysteriously dying south of the city went mostly unnoticed. But it wouldn't stay that way. Just 2 weeks after Rosa was killed, another grisly murder took place. Like before, it was an African-American female. The Constitution ran the headline, "Murder of Negroes Stirs Up Big Mob." According to the article, a large number of officers showed up at a house over on Spencer Street, west of downtown and in present-day Vine City. The paper described the gruesome scene. At the house where the murdered negress lay, there were several hundred people drawn by curiosity to see the woman's mutilated head as it dangled by a narrow strip of flesh from the body. The woman's name was Lucinda McNeil, and the article went on to explain that the murder was committed by her husband, who was allegedly extremely drunk. In a fit of rage, he slashed her throat with a razor, and then when that broke, he switched to a pocket knife. Several neighbors, also black, witnessed the whole bloody ordeal, and when the husband fled, they chased him down and detained him. The husband was arrested on the spot and was later sentenced to life in prison for the crime. It was apparent that this was some kind of really horrible domestic dispute and not the work of a serial murderer. However, on February 20th, the Atlanta Georgian ran an article on another mysterious murder. Here it is. The remains of a murdered unknown Negro woman were found Sunday just off of the Beltline east of Grant Park. They were lying within 200 yards of where a similar crime was committed about 2 or 3 months ago. Both women were slain in the same manner, struck in the head with some heavy instrument and the throat cut. This is about the 10th Negro woman to be mysteriously murdered in the outskirts of Atlanta during the past 12 months. Detective Starnes is investigating the murder. Now, it's true that in 1910, the year before our story begins, there was an uptick of violence directed at black women in Atlanta. Several of the murdered women died by blunt force trauma, but most of them died by a gunshot from an unknown assailant. Now, as it was back then, it's impossible to know if any of these murders were connected. So by this time, February of 1911, when this second woman was found murdered in the same way as Rosa Trice, throat slashed, skull crushed, Atlanta's black community was already on edge. Rumors swirled about who might be behind these seemingly disconnected murders. March and April passed mostly without incident. In March, President Taft visited and the city threw a huge parade for him through Atlanta. Thousands of people packed the streets of downtown to catch a glimpse of the 27th president. But then, on May the 7th, another mysterious death. The Constitution reported. Shot from a distance by an unknown Negro man, Rosa Rivers, a negress of 122 Randolph Street, is at Grady Hospital, where it is said she is fatally wounded. The shooting occurred at the corner of Auburn Avenue and Howell Street last night at about 10:30 o'clock. The woman was in company with her sister and another Negro woman when a man approached them and fired. He escaped. Again, this article was barely a footnote in that day's paper, a mere 69 words buried all the way at the bottom of the page, right next to an ad for Celestine's Natural Alkaline Water. Now, if you're familiar with Atlanta today, or if you visited as a tourist, you may have eaten at a really great food hall called Krog Street Market. This shooting of Rosa Rivers took place just a few blocks from there. Now, we can't totally connect this murder with the previous two, especially since the mode of killing was different. However, there are some similarities. Number one, the victims were similar, young African-American women. Number two, the victims were all killed within a couple blocks from their homes. Number three, the victims were all killed late at night. Number four, the victims were all killed on the edges of the city. And I'd also note here that this shooting took place fairly close to where the unidentified woman was found near Grant Park. And finally, number five, there was no known motive and no suspects. A pattern was beginning to develop. On May 27th, another murder. The body of Belle Walker was discovered in a field, and this time not one but two of the Atlanta newspapers covered it. Here's what the Constitution had to say. Her throat cut with a jagged edge, Belle Walker, a Negro cook, was found dead yesterday morning, about 35 yards from her home on Garibaldi Street. The Georgian posted a longer write-up and included the interesting detail that Belle Walker was a cook for a police officer named Andrews. She was killed on her way home from the Andrews house. Was Belle targeted because she worked for an Atlanta police officer? At this point, no one knew. Then, finally, the Georgian connects a few dots. A number of Negro women have been mysteriously murdered in the outskirts of Atlanta during the past few months, and the police believe a regular Jack the Ripper is operating here. In nearly every instance, the murders have been similar. The victims' throats cut. Now, this was, as far as I can tell, the first time an Atlanta paper used the R word in reference to these murders. Ripper. The reference, of course, is to London's infamous serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper went on a killing spree in the fall of 1888. He murdered at least 5 women, all prostitutes, in the same borough on the east side of London. Jack the Ripper was known for slashing his victims' throats and in several cases removing specific organs in a surgical fashion. He cut out the heart and intestines of one victim. He cut out the kidney of another and mailed it to the police headquarters. Because of his apparent knowledge of human anatomy, this prompted many to speculate that he was a physician by day and a sinister madman by night. Jack the Ripper was not the first serial killer, but he was the first to dominate the headlines. The gory nature of the killings, combined with the fact that the killer would write taunting letters to the police, created a firestorm in the London papers. As American newsmen reposted the salacious stories, the legend of Jack the Ripper crossed the Atlantic, haunting the dreams of horrified Americans for years to come. So here we are in Atlanta in 1911, 23 years after the London Ripper's reign of terror. We have to assume that the journalists at the time, all men, would have been young boys when the Jack the Ripper story was at its peak. I'm sure they grew up hearing and telling spooky tales about a midnight stalker lurking in the shadows. So it makes sense that when female bodies with slashed throats began turning up in Atlanta, these journalists would reach for the most fitting word they knew, Ripper. And it wouldn't be the last. On June 15th, the papers reported yet another murder. It's worth noting here that this Constitution article makes no mention of a Ripper, and it doesn't connect this murder with any of the others. Here's what it said. Addie Watts, a Negro woman, was found dead yesterday morning near the corner of DeKalb Avenue and Krog Street, with her head smashed in with a coupling pin and her throat cut. She had been dragged from the side of the street almost to the railroad bank, which is very steep at this point. It is thought that her murderers intended to let the train mutilate her body in an effort to hide the crime. Now, if you don't know what a coupling pin is, you're not weird. I didn't either. It's basically a heavy steel cylinder that connected railroad cars. Remember, Atlanta was a railroad town, so snagging one of these from a train wouldn't have been hard. The location of this murder is super familiar to me because it happened less than a mile from where I currently live. The article noted that Watts's body was found at the corner of DeKalb Avenue and Krog Street. This is a really popular area now due to the Atlanta Beltline and Krog Tunnel, which is covered wall to wall with graffiti. I'll talk a lot more about Krog Tunnel in another episode. I ride my bike through this area all the time now, and I know the exact railroad bank which the article noted was very steep. The railroad tracks here are the exact same ones that would have been there in 1911. I can't imagine dragging a body up that embankment to where the trains are. This small detail sort of gives us an idea of how formidable this killer was. He must have been a fairly strong dude to be able to drag a body all the way up to the train tracks. And I've got to wonder, why is this guy set on dragging the bodies of those he's killed? It seems like once you killed someone, you'd want to get away as quickly as possible, not attract a lot of attention by dragging a body 50 or 100 feet. The article about Addie Watts ends by saying a black man, John Daniel, was arrested in connection with her murder, but it didn't say much more than that. At the end of June, another woman turned up dead, a young black woman by the name of Lizzie Watkins. Her cause of death? A deep laceration across her throat. Watkins' body was discovered in some brambles over in Atlanta's West End neighborhood, several miles west of the previous murders. Today, Atlanta locals love a brewery on that side of town, It's in a warehouse called the Monday Night Garage, and if you've ever been there, you're right near the place they found Lizzie Watkins' body. As far as I can tell, this was the first murder to receive a headline on the front page of an Atlanta newspaper, the Journal. It's now the end of June, the 6th month of our story, and we now have 6 women, all killed under mysterious and bloody circumstances. All the victims were young, African-American females, and 5 of them were killed in the same gruesome way. I'll note here that nothing much came of the John Daniels arrest. Multiple killings happened while he was behind bars, which basically exonerated him as the perpetrator. So, who was behind these murders? Why was he or they targeting poor black women? What was his motive, and would he ever be caught? In June, the answers were scarce. But that was about to change. As the sticky heat of a Georgia summer settled in across Atlanta, Ripper mania would settle in as well. July would bring a brand new wave of mysterious killings. And it would also bring the first haunting tale of a woman who stood eye to eye with our midnight stalker and escaped to tell about it. All that on the next episode of Catlick. Hey friends, BT here. One final thing. Hey, if you remember from episode 1, I talked about The Vault. The Vault is packed with exclusive bonus content not found here in the normal podcast. I also mentioned that a feature of The Vault is something I call a half-lick. Half-licks are mini in-between episodes. They're about 10 minutes long and are available only to Vault subscribers. But I've got a hot tip for those of you who stuck with me to the end of this episode. We've created a fantastic half-lick episode covering the Atlanta race riot of 1906. I go into a lot more detail about the horror of those 4 violent days in Atlanta and how it all went down. The best news? We're making this first half-lick available as a freebie to everyone. To check it out, just go to catlick.com/3. The 3 is for episode 3. Once again, that's catlick.com/3. Catlick is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. It's written and produced by me, BT Harman. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harman. Original music and sound design by Ciel. If you're feeling this story, be sure to let us know by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to great podcasts. It makes a huge difference. And remember, you can subscribe to the Catlick Vault at catlick.com. This is BT Harman, reminding you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. I'll see you in the next episode.